The Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has been laid to rest in Moscow. The fiercest critic of President Vladimir Putin died 2 weeks ago in a remote Arctic penal colony. Thousands gathered outside the church where his funeral was held, in defiance of a heavy police presence and warnings from the Kremlin. One human rights group says at least 67 people have been arrested at nationwide tributes.
Crowds of mourners chant, "Russia will be free," as they queue outside the church in Moscow where the funeral of Alexei Navalny was held. The anti-corruption campaigner, who once galvanized huge protests against the Russian government, also brought thousands to the streets after his death to bid him farewell. Despite the police blockade and the risk of arrest.
There are something like 10,000 people here. No one is afraid. We came here because we want to honor the memory of the person who was not scared of anything.
For many of those here, it's just important to see people who agree that what happened is terrible and that there are a lot of people who think this.
Authorities banned a traditional public burial, and the Kremlin warned against what they called protests taking place outside the church. Inside the church, Alexei's family and friends paid their final respects. Before the coffin was transported to a cemetery near the banks of the Moskva River. Where his parents said goodbye to their son. Navalny's wife, Yulia Navalnaya, was not present at the funeral. She is living outside of Russia, saying she could be arrested if she returns. She posted her farewell to her husband on social media, thanking him for 26 years of happiness. She has vowed to continue her husband's work.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Doug Klain, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre in Fairfax, Virginia. Thanks so much for joining us here on DW, Doug. The Kremlin didn't want this funeral to take place the way that it did. They actually tried to force Navalny's mother to have a secret burial. So with this in mind, were you surprised to see them allow thousands of people bid him farewell in Moscow?
Thanks for having me. I would say I'm not surprised with how things went today. The Kremlin wanted to avoid public shows of support for Navalny, Putin's greatest challenger, and an explicit defiance of the Kremlin. If the Kremlin tried to prevent a public gathering at Navalny's funeral, they really would have had to bring out the riot police. They would have had to forcefully keep people from paying their tributes. And that really would have resulted in images of the police cracking down and beating people in the streets. The Kremlin, I think, probably made the calculation that it was better to avoid those images which could further turn Navalny into a martyr, as well as those who would have suffered police brutality for it. So I think that this was the Kremlin making a calculated choice, that this was the best way to, in a way, allow the Russian society to let out some steam.
I mean, with that being said, dozens of people were still arrested. So what kind of obstacles did the Kremlin put in the way of the funeral?
Well, there were a number of things the Kremlin did in advance to try to hamper the efforts to quite literally lay this man to rest. It was difficult for Navalny's family to get a hearse to carry his body for today. Different funeral agencies reported getting calls of intimidation, threatening them, telling them, do not do anything to associate yourselves with Navalny and his burial. So the Kremlin also brought out riot police today who watched over the thousands of people that came in the streets to pay their tributes, throwing flowers, chanting no to war, and paying their tributes to Navalny.
And to all of us outside of Russia, Navalny was really the face of the anti-Putin opposition. But how symbolic of a figure was he among the Russian public?
Well, Navalny elicited some feelings of relative apathy among most Russians. His core of support was young, urban Russians. He did not enjoy widespread support in Russia, at least not publicly or by any measure of trackable public opinion. Most people simply saw him as getting involved in politics, something that often is looked down upon a bit. Still, Navalny elicited strong support among those who did follow him. Going forward, it'll be worth watching to see just how much his wife, Yulia, takes up the mantle of leadership in Russia's liberal opposition. She is abroad as well and did not go back for the funeral today for fear of facing arrest, just as he faced when he went back after being poisoned.
Exactly. So let's go into a little bit more detail there. What role could Navalny's widow actually play going forward?
I think the Russian opposition right now is at something of a turning point. Over the last 2 years with the war and with Navalny in penal colonies, they've been spread abroad, scattered. Before Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he took great pains to eviscerate Russian civil society in opposition to his rule. Now they face a point. What comes next? What comes after Navalny? What can be advocated? Is it simply going against Putin? Is it going against the war? And I think that the opposition faces real choices. This could be something of a turning point, particularly with what could be real new leadership.
Doug Klain, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.